Our story begins during a time of deep sorrow and oppression. For 40 long years, the Israelites were crushed under the iron grip of the Philistines. They were a people who had once been led by prophets and warriors, yet now they found themselves scattered, their spirits broken. There was no hero in sight, no one to stand up against their enemies. In the midst of this despair, many wondered, had God forgotten them? But what they didn't know was that salvation was about to come from the most unexpected place. In the quiet, almost forgotten town of Zorah, there lived a man named Manoah. He was a man of simple faith, belonging to the tribe of Dan. Yet for all his belief in God, there was one thing missing in his life. He and his wife had no children. Year after year, they prayed, but no child ever came. The house that should have been filled with the laughter of children remained silent. A painful reminder of their unfulfilled hopes. But little did they know, their prayers were not in vain. One day, something miraculous happened. Something that would change the course of their lives and the fate of their people. As Manoah's wife went about her daily tasks, perhaps preparing a meal or walking through their fields, she suddenly felt an overwhelming presence. The sky seemed to glow brighter, and before her stood a figure she could barely comprehend, an angel of the Lord, shimmering with divine light. His voice was calm yet powerful, echoing with the authority of heaven itself. "You are barren and childless," he began, acknowledging her deepest sorrow. "But soon, you will give birth to a son." Her heart stopped for a moment. Was this a dream? Could this truly be happening? After so many years of waiting, of feeling the sting of barrenness, here was an angelic messenger telling her that her greatest longing was about to be fulfilled. But there was more to this promise, much more than just the joy of having a child. The angel continued, "This child will be no ordinary boy. He will be set apart from birth. He is to be a Nazirite dedicated to God from the very beginning. No razor will ever touch his head, and he will not drink wine or eat anything unclean. This boy, this son of yours will begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines." Imagine the rush of emotions that flooded her at that moment. Joy, wonder, awe, and even fear. The weight of this prophecy was immense. Her son was destined to be a deliverer, a chosen one. The promise of a child was already overwhelming, but the promise that this child would lead their people to freedom? It was almost too much to bear. Her feet barely touched the ground as she ran home, her heart pounding with excitement. She had to tell her husband, Manoah, what had just happened. Bursting through the door, she recounted every detail to him. The angel, the prophecy, the instructions they must follow. But Manoah, ever the cautious one, needed more. Could it truly be? Could the words of this angelic visitor be trusted? He fell to his knees and prayed, asking the Lord to send the angel again, not out of doubt, but out of a desire to understand exactly what they needed to do. After all, this child was not just any child. He was a child of destiny with a divine mission to fulfill. God, in his mercy, heard Manoah's prayer and answered. The angel appeared once more, and this time, Manoah himself was present. Trembling, Manoah asked the angel, "When your words are fulfilled, what is to be the rule that governs the boy's life and work? How are we to raise such a child?" The angel, with infinite patience, reiterated the sacred instructions. Manoah's wife must follow everything he had commanded her. The child must be set apart from the moment of his birth. No wine, no unclean food, and his hair must remain untouched by a razor. This boy would be a Nazirite for life, dedicated to God's service from the very start. Manoah, still overwhelmed by the enormity of it all, wanted to honor this divine messenger. "Please," he said, "let us prepare an offering for you." But the angel, knowing his mission was complete, declined the offer, reminding them that it was the Lord they should honor. And with that, the angel ascended back into the heavens, leaving Manoah and his wife in awe of what they had just witnessed. As time passed, the miraculous promise was fulfilled. Manoah's wife gave birth to a son, and they named him Samson, a name that would echo through the ages. From the moment he was born, it was clear that this child was special. There was something about him, something divine, and as he grew, so did his strength, both physical and spiritual. The Spirit of the Lord stirred within him, marking him as the one chosen to lead his people. But as with all great callings, Samson's life would not be easy. The weight of his destiny, the expectations placed upon him, and the temptations of the world would all threaten to pull him away from the path God had set for him. Would he rise to the challenge? Would he fulfill the prophecy and deliver Israel from their enemies? Or would the very strength that made him a hero become the source of his downfall? Samson's early feats in conflict with the Philistines. Samson was growing into a man of astonishing strength, and the Spirit of the Lord was clearly upon him. But even as he matured, the weight of his calling began to conflict with the desires of his heart. It was in this tension that Samson would face his first great test. One day, as a young man, Samson journeyed down to the Philistine town of Timnah. There, among the enemies of his people, he saw a woman, a Philistine woman who caught his eye. Her beauty captivated him, and without hesitation, he knew what he wanted. When he returned home, he approached his parents with a bold and unexpected request. "I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah," he told them, his eyes filled with determination. "Now get her for me as my wife." His words must have struck his parents like a lightning bolt. How could their son, chosen by God to deliver Israel from the Philistines, seek to marry one of the very people he was destined to fight? His parents, deeply dismayed, tried to reason with him. "Isn't there an acceptable woman among your own people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to find a wife?" they asked, their voices pleading with concern. But Samson was undeterred. He insisted, "Get her for me. She is the right one for me." What Samson's parents didn't realize was that this desire, this pull toward the Philistine woman, was part of a larger divine plan. The Lord was seeking an opportunity to confront the Philistines, and Samson's impulsive choice would be the catalyst for an inevitable conflict. As Samson set out to meet this woman again, the path took him through a forest, dense and quiet. But the silence was soon shattered by a sound that sent a chill through the air, the unmistakable roar of a lion. In a flash, a young lion, fierce and wild, charged at Samson, its powerful legs pounding the earth beneath it. For any ordinary man, this would have been the end. But Samson was no ordinary man. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, filling him with divine strength beyond human comprehension. In that moment, Samson grabbed the lion with his bare hands, and in a feat of unimaginable power, he tore the beast apart as easily as one might tear a young goat. The lion's carcass fell to the ground in pieces, a silent testament to the supernatural strength coursing through Samson's veins. But what was perhaps most remarkable was what happened afterward. Samson told no one, not his father, not his mother. The victory over the lion was his secret to keep, as if it were a quiet reminder of the power he possessed, a power that would only grow with time. As he continued on his journey, his thoughts likely returned to the Philistine woman who had captivated him. He would marry her. He was certain of it. When the time came, he made the arrangements and the wedding feast was set, but Samson's life was never meant to be simple. As he made his way back to Timnah to wed his bride, something drew him off the main path. He returned to the place where he had slain the lion, perhaps out of curiosity or a strange pull to revisit the scene of his first great triumph. There, among the remains of the carcass, he found something unexpected. A swarm of bees had made their home inside the lion's lifeless body, and they had produced honey. With no hesitation, Samson scooped out the honey with his hands and ate it as he walked. There was something almost poetic about the moment. Out of death, something sweet had come. It was a mystery, a puzzle of nature, but one that mirrored the complex life Samson was living. He even shared the honey with his parents, but once again, he kept the source of the honey a secret. At the wedding feast in Timnah, surrounded by Philistines, Samson's thoughts turned to his recent experience. The riddle of the lion and the honey weighed on his mind, and suddenly, he saw an opportunity to challenge his new companions. In a bold move, he proposed a riddle to the 30 Philistine men who were attending the feast. "Let me tell you a riddle," Samson said, his eyes glinting with mischief. "If you can give me the answer within the 7 days of the feast, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. But if you can't answer, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes." The men, intrigued and perhaps a bit overconfident, accepted the challenge. "Tell us your riddle," they said. "Let's hear it." Samson leaned in, his voice low and mysterious as he spoke. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. The Philistines furrowed their brows. It was a clever riddle, one that seemed impossible to solve. For 3 days they wrestled with it, trying to unlock its meaning, but they could not find the answer. Frustration and desperation began to creep in, and by the 4th day, the stakes felt too high. The Philistine men turned to Samson's new bride, their frustration boiling over into threats. "Coax your husband into telling you the answer to the riddle," they demanded, "or we will burn you and your father's household to death. Did you bring us here to steal from us?" Terrified, Samson's bride approached him in tears, her face stained with anguish. "You hate me," she cried. "You don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer." Samson, unshaken, tried to dismiss her. "I haven't even explained it to my father or mother," he said. "So why should I explain it to you?" But her tears and pleas didn't stop. Day after day she pressed him, her sobs filling the air until Samson could no longer bear the weight of her misery. Finally, on the 7th day of the feast, he gave in. He told her the answer to the riddle, unable to resist her relentless pleading. His wife wasted no time. She ran to the Philistine men and revealed the secret that Samson had kept so carefully hidden. Before sunset on the 7th day, the men approached Samson, smug with triumph. "What is sweeter than honey?" they said. "What is stronger than a lion?" Samson's heart sank. He knew instantly what had happened. His bride had betrayed him, and his riddle had been solved not through wit, but through deceit. Anger surged through him, and he turned to the men, his voice bitter and sharp. "If you had not plowed with my heifer," he said, "you would not have solved my riddle." The riddle, betrayal, and revenge. Samson stood in stunned silence, the sting of betrayal burning deep within him. The very woman he had chosen, the one he had fought for against his parents' wishes, had sold his secret to his enemies. His riddle, which was supposed to be a game, a test of wit and strength, had been solved through deceit. His bride had been coerced into betraying him, and now the Philistines stood smugly before him, gloating over their victory. But Samson was not a man to be taken lightly, and this betrayal would not go unanswered. Burning with anger, Samson left the feast abruptly. His heart was ablaze with fury, but it wasn't just his pride that had been wounded. It was something much deeper. The humiliation he felt at the hands of the Philistines, his enemies, would not be forgotten. And Samson, gifted with strength beyond any man, would make them pay. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him once again, flooding him with divine power and wrath. He made his way to the Philistine town of Ashkelon, where he struck down 30 of their men. It was a brutal, decisive act of revenge. Samson stripped the dead of their clothing and returned to the men who had solved his riddle. Without a word, he handed them the garments they had so smugly demanded. The message was clear. Samson was not a man to be trifled with. But even with the blood of his enemies still on his hands, Samson's anger was not satisfied. He returned home, leaving behind his bride and the wedding feast, his heart hardened by betrayal. The fire that had once burned with passion for his Philistine bride was now cold, replaced by the bitter taste of betrayal. In the days that followed, Samson's bride was given to another man, one of his companions who had attended him at the feast. It was as if the insult to Samson's honor couldn't be any greater. First, his riddle had been stolen, and now the woman he had chosen was taken from him and given to another. But Samson had not forgotten. And while he retreated for a time, his desire for revenge simmered, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Later, as the wheat harvest approached, Samson returned to visit his wife, unaware of the betrayal that awaited him. With a young goat in tow, a customary gift, he arrived at her father's house, ready to be reunited with her. But when he asked to see his wife, her father stood in the doorway, blocking his entrance. "I was sure you hated her," her father explained, his voice hesitant, "so I gave her to your companion. But isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead." The words hit Samson like a hammer. His wife, the one he had fought for, the one he had risked so much to marry, had been given away like a piece of property. The suggestion that her younger sister could take her place was an even deeper insult. His blood boiled, his fists clenched, and the fire of revenge that had been smoldering within him erupted into a blazing inferno. "This time," Samson said, his voice low and seething with anger, "I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them." With a determination fueled by vengeance, Samson devised a plan that would strike at the heart of the Philistines' livelihood. He went out and captured 300 foxes, an impossible feat for any ordinary man. But for Samson, it was just the beginning. He tied the foxes tail to tail in pairs and fastened torches to their tails. Then, with a grim smile, he lit the torches and set the foxes loose in the Philistine fields. The flames spread quickly through the standing grain, the vineyards, and the olive groves. The smell of burning crops filled the air, and the once green fields of the Philistines were reduced to smoldering ash. Their harvest, their sustenance, their very means of survival was wiped out in a single night by Samson's act of revenge. The cries of the Philistines echoed across the land as their fields burned, their fury rising alongside the flames. When the Philistines discovered who was behind the destruction, they sought out the cause of their suffering. "Who did this?" they demanded. And they were told, "Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because his wife was given to his companion." Fueled by their own thirst for vengeance, the Philistines struck back in the cruelest way possible. They went to Samson's former wife and her father, and in a brutal act of retaliation, they set their house on fire, burning them both alive. The screams of Samson's former bride and her family echoed through the night as they perished in the flames, victims of the growing war between Samson and the Philistines. When news of their deaths reached Samson, his rage knew no bounds. His heart, already hardened by betrayal, was now filled with a burning desire for blood. "Since you have acted like this," he declared, his voice shaking with fury, "I swear that I won't stop until I get my revenge on you." And with that, Samson unleashed his fury upon the Philistines. He attacked them viciously, slaughtering many of them in a relentless display of strength and rage. His blows were fierce, his vengeance swift, and the Philistines fell before him like wheat before the scythe. But even as he fought, even as he spilled the blood of his enemies, there was a sense that this was only the beginning. After his bloody rampage, Samson retreated once more, this time to a cave in the rock of Etam. But the Philistines were not content to let him rest. They wanted him captured, subdued, and brought to justice for the devastation he had caused. Gathering their forces, they went up and camped in Judah, spreading out near the town of Lehi. The people of Judah, terrified of the Philistines' wrath, sought out Samson in his hiding place. 3,000 men from Judah approached the cave, their faces filled with fear and frustration. "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us?" they asked him, their voices filled with desperation. "What have you done to us?" Samson's response was cold and matter-of-fact. "I merely did to them what they did to me." But the men of Judah were not interested in his reasoning. They had come with a purpose, and that purpose was to hand Samson over to the Philistines, hoping to prevent further bloodshed. "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to them," they said, their fear evident. Samson's eyes narrowed. He knew what they intended, but he had one condition. "Swear to me," he said, "that you won't kill me yourselves." "Agreed," they answered. "We will only tie you up and hand you over to them. We will not kill you." With that, they bound Samson with 2 new ropes and led him up from the rock. The Philistines, seeing their enemy brought before them in chains, shouted in triumph. They believed that the mighty Samson, the man who had terrorized them, was finally in their grasp. But they were wrong. Samson's rise to power and unchecked rage. As Samson stood bound before the Philistines, the people of Judah looked on in silence. They had delivered their strongest warrior into the hands of their enemies, hoping to avoid further conflict. But what they didn't realize was that this was no ordinary man standing before them. Samson, with his immense strength and the Spirit of the Lord upon him, was about to turn the tide of battle once again. The Philistines approached him with shouts of victory, their voices filled with arrogance and anticipation. They believed that they had finally captured the man who had wreaked havoc upon their people. But Samson was not truly bound, at least not in the way they thought. The new ropes that held him, taut and strong, suddenly became like strands of charred flax in his hands. With a surge of divine power, Samson snapped the ropes as if they were nothing, and they fell away, useless against his strength. In the chaos that followed, Samson's eyes scanned the ground, searching for a weapon. There was no sword, no spear in sight, but his gaze fell upon something unexpected, the fresh jawbone of a donkey. Without hesitation, he grabbed the jawbone and with a roar of fury, turned on the Philistines. What happened next was nothing short of legendary. Samson, armed with only the jawbone, struck down 1,000 men. The Philistines who had come to capture him were now fleeing in terror, falling before his unstoppable wrath. The ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen, and in the midst of it all stood Samson, victorious, bloodied, and breathing heavily, the jawbone still clutched in his hand. It was a scene of pure devastation, a reminder of the raw, divine power that resided within him. When the battle was over, Samson looked around at the destruction he had caused. With a sense of grim satisfaction, he raised the jawbone high and spoke. "With a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men." The Philistines were broken once more, but Samson's victory came at a price. As the adrenaline faded and the dust settled, exhaustion overtook him. The intense heat of the battle and the sheer force he had exerted left him weak and parched. His mouth was dry, and his strength, which had carried him through so many battles, now seemed to slip away. For the first time in a long while, Samson felt vulnerable. In his desperation, Samson cried out to the Lord, "You have given your servant this great victory," he said, his voice hoarse and strained. "Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" It was a rare moment of humility for the mighty warrior. In his weakest hour, Samson turned to the only source of strength he had ever truly relied on, God. And God, ever faithful, heard his plea. In response to Samson's prayer, the Lord opened up a hollow place in the ground at Lehi, and water gushed forth. Samson drank deeply, and as the cool water touched his lips and flowed down his throat, his strength returned. Revived and refreshed, he was once again ready to fulfill his role as Israel's protector and avenger. The place where this miracle occurred was called On HaKoreh, and it remained as a testament to God's provision for his servant. But as time passed, Samson's unchecked power began to take a darker turn. His victories over the Philistines were great, but his heart was slowly being consumed by his own desires. Samson, though chosen by God, was still a man, and like all men, he was susceptible to temptation. His feats of strength had brought him fame and fear among the Philistines, but his weakness for women would soon lead him down a dangerous path. Despite his divine calling, Samson often let his heart and his desires lead him astray. One day, Samson traveled to Gaza, a major Philistine city, where he saw a beautiful woman. She was a prostitute, and Samson, driven by his lust, went to spend the night with her. Word of Samson's presence quickly spread through the city, and the people of Gaza, seizing the opportunity to capture their enemy, surrounded the house where he was staying. They laid in wait, confident that when dawn broke, Samson would be at their mercy. But Samson was no fool. In the dead of night, while the Philistines lay sleeping outside the city gate, Samson rose and took hold of the very gates that were meant to keep him trapped. With a feat of strength that defied reason, he tore the gates from their hinges, lifting not only the doors but the posts and bar as well. The Philistines who had planned to capture him awoke in horror to see their city's defenses crumbling in Samson's grasp. But Samson didn't just destroy the gates, he carried them. With the massive city gates balanced on his shoulders, he marched up to the top of the hill that faced Hebron, leaving the Philistines to watch in stunned silence. The sight of Samson, their enemy, carrying away the gates of their city, was a powerful symbol. It wasn't just a show of strength, it was a message. Nothing could contain him. Nothing could stop him. Despite this display of power, Samson's actions revealed a deeper truth. He was becoming reckless. His strength was unparalleled, but his discipline was faltering. With every victory, Samson was drifting further from the divine mission he had been called to fulfill. His heart, once driven by a desire to free his people, was now clouded by his own wants and impulses, and it was in this growing darkness that Samson's greatest downfall would soon emerge. Sometime later, Samson's path crossed with a woman named Delilah, a name that would forever be linked to his eventual ruin. Delilah lived in the valley of Sorek, and when Samson saw her, he was once again overcome by desire. He fell in love with her, completely unaware that she would soon become the instrument of his destruction. The rulers of the Philistines, who had long sought to capture Samson, saw their chance. They went to Delilah, offering her an enormous sum of silver, 1,100 shekels from each ruler, if she could discover the secret of Samson's great strength. The offer was too tempting to resist, and Delilah agreed to betray the man who loved her. Thus began the final act of the tragic drama that was Samson's life. Night after night, Delilah coaxed Samson, using her charm and beauty to weaken his defenses. "Tell me the secret of your great strength," she pleaded, her voice sweet and persuasive. "How can you be tied up and subdued?" At first, Samson played along, giving her false answers. "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man," he told her. And so, Delilah tied him with the bowstrings while Philistine men hid in the room, ready to strike. But when she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you," he snapped the bowstrings with ease. Delilah's frustration grew, but she did not give up. She continued her questioning, determined to find the truth. And Samson, caught in the web of his own desires, remained by her side, unaware of the danger that lurked behind her sweet words. The seduction of Delilah and the fall of Samson. Night after night, Delilah persisted. Her words were soft and her tone sweet, but each time she asked the question, Samson could feel the weight of her persistence pressing down on him. "Tell me the secret of your great strength," she would plead, wrapping him in her arms, her eyes full of feigned affection. For any other man, her charms might have been enough to break their defenses, but Samson, for now, remained strong in his deception. Each time he gave her false answers, enjoying the game of cat and mouse. "If anyone ties me with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man," he told her one evening. Delilah smiled, and once again as Samson slept, she tied him with the ropes, calling out to the hidden Philistines waiting nearby. "Samson, the Philistines are upon you," she cried, her voice laced with urgency. But when Samson awoke, the ropes snapped as if they were nothing more than threads. He stood tall, his strength unbroken, as the Philistines fled once again, powerless against him. Frustration gnawed at Delilah. She had been promised a fortune in silver if she could uncover Samson's secret, but so far, all her efforts had failed. Her patience was wearing thin, but so was Samson's. The once playful game was turning into a test of endurance, and Delilah was determined to win. Her next attempt was no different. Samson, teasing her again, said, "If you weave the 7 braids of my hair into the fabric on a loom and tighten it with a pin, I'll become as weak as any other man." As before, Delilah took his words and tried them, weaving his long hair into the loom while he slept, her fingers deft and quick. Again, she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And again, Samson awoke, pulling the loom from the fabric with ease. The Philistines had no chance against his strength, but Delilah was growing desperate. Each failure brought her closer to the edge, her frustration bubbling over into anger. "How can you say you love me," she sobbed, her eyes wide with accusation, "when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you've made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your strength." Her voice echoed with reproach, and for the first time, Samson felt the pressure. Day after day, she pressed him, her persistence unrelenting, until he was sick with it. Her tears, her pleading, and her accusations wore him down, chipping away at the walls of his resolve. Samson, the mighty warrior who had defeated armies and torn lions apart with his bare hands, found himself weakened not by physical force, but by the constant emotional assault from the woman he loved. Finally, Samson could endure no more. Exhausted, he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of his confession. "Because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." The words hung in the air, laden with the gravity of his admission. For the first time, Samson had revealed the true source of his strength, a strength not of his own making, but a gift from God, bound to the sacred vow he had kept since birth. Delilah's eyes gleamed. She knew now that she had him. She sent word to the Philistine rulers once more, "Come back one more time, he has told me everything." And this time, they came with silver in hand, ready to finally capture the man who had eluded them for so long. That night, as Samson lay in Delilah's lap, she soothed him to sleep. Her touch gentle, her voice soft. But as soon as he drifted off, she called for a man to shave off the 7 braids of his hair. One by one, the locks fell to the ground, and with them, Samson's divine strength. When the deed was done, Delilah whispered in his ear, her voice cutting through the darkness. "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But this time, when Samson awoke, he was not the man he once was. He reached for his strength, but it was gone, drained from him like water slipping through his fingers. He thought he could shake himself free, as he had so many times before, but the Lord had left him. His power was no longer his to command. The Philistines seized him, their long-awaited moment of victory finally at hand. Samson, the mighty warrior, the man who had terrorized them for years, was now helpless before them. They bound him with bronze shackles, and in an act of brutal cruelty, they gouged out his eyes, leaving him blind and broken. Samson was taken down to Gaza, the city whose gates he had once carried away in triumph. Now, those same gates closed behind him as he was thrown into prison, a defeated shadow of the man he once was. There in the darkness, Samson was forced to grind grain, a task meant for animals, a symbol of his fall from grace. But even in his darkest hour, there was a flicker of hope. Though Samson had been defeated, though his strength had been stripped from him and his sight taken, something began to change. Slowly, imperceptibly, his hair began to grow back. The Philistines, drunk on their victory, did not notice the quiet miracle that was unfolding. They believed Samson was no longer a threat, and they celebrated their triumph with reckless abandon. Their greatest enemy had been reduced to nothing, and they praised their god Dagon for delivering Samson into their hands. One day, the Philistine rulers gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon. The temple was filled with men and women, all eager to celebrate the fall of Israel's champion. In their revelry, they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." And so Samson, blind and bound, was brought out to perform for them, his once mighty frame now a source of mockery. As the crowd jeered and laughed, Samson stood among them, his hands grasping the pillars that supported the temple. He could hear the voices of his enemies, the cheers of those who had longed for his downfall. But Samson's mind was elsewhere. His thoughts turned to God, to the strength he had once possessed, and to the sacred vow he had broken. In that moment, Samson prayed, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." With his hands braced against the pillars, Samson felt the surge of strength return to him, a final gift from the Lord. The pillars trembled beneath his grasp as he pushed with all his might, his heart filled with the desire for one last act of redemption. "Let me die with the Philistines," he cried, and with a mighty push, the temple collapsed. The walls came crashing down, the ground shook, and the laughter of the Philistines turned to screams of terror as the temple fell, crushing the rulers and all the people inside. In his final act, Samson killed more of his enemies in his death than he had in his life. The once mighty warrior, flawed and broken, had found redemption in his final breath. His story was one of both triumph and tragedy, a reminder of the great strength that comes from God and the consequences of straying from his path. Samson's imprisonment and final redemption. As the Philistines drag a chained and blinded Samson into their stronghold, the image is haunting. Once the mighty warrior of Israel, now a broken man, Samson's fall is complete. His strength, once feared, has been stripped away. His confidence, once unshakable, has crumbled into despair. The Philistines mock him, celebrating their victory. They've captured the man who once terrorized their armies, and now they believe he's powerless. But Samson's story is far from over. Locked in the cold, damp darkness of his prison cell, Samson is no longer the proud, that untouchable man he once was. His flowing hair, his source of strength, has been sheared off, a symbol of his betrayal and weakness. Yet in this isolation, a quiet transformation begins. Stripped of everything, Samson finally starts to see clearly. Ironically, his physical blindness brings a deeper understanding of his purpose. It's here, in the belly of humiliation, that Samson starts to reconnect with the God who had called him from birth. As days pass, his hair begins to grow, but more importantly, so does his faith. Samson, once caught in a spiral of self-destruction and indulgence, begins to reflect on the divine mission he abandoned. Conclusion and lessons from Samson's life. Samson's life is a story of extremes: strength and weakness, triumph and failure, sin and redemption. But more than anything, his story teaches us about the complexity of human nature and the unfailing mercy of God. Samson was flawed, driven by impulsive desires, and often strayed from his divine calling. Yet in the end, it wasn't his failures that defined him, but his return to God. In our lives, like Samson, we may stumble, make mistakes, and even lose sight of our purpose. But his story reminds us that it's never too late to turn back to the path we were meant to follow. Redemption is always within reach, even when we feel farthest from it. Samson's final act teaches us that true strength isn't just about physical power. It's about recognizing our dependence on something greater. It's about humility, faith, and trusting that, no matter how far we've fallen, we can rise again. In the end, Samson was not defined by his failures, but by his willingness to surrender to God's will, even when it meant his life. The story of Samson is more than a tale of physical might. It's a story of the battle within, a struggle we all face between our own desires and our higher purpose. As much as Samson was powerful, he was also deeply human, prone to weakness, doubt, and mistakes. Yet, his final act reminds us that it's not the mistakes we make that define us, but how we respond when faced with the consequences of those mistakes. In the end, Samson's life echoes the message that strength comes in many forms. True power lies not in our ability to control the world around us, but in our ability to control ourselves and trust in something greater. Samson, blind and humbled, found his greatest moment of clarity when he put his trust back in God. It was that faith, not just his strength, that allowed him to bring down the Philistine temple and fulfill his divine destiny. As we conclude this story, we are left with one final thought. We all face moments of weakness, moments where we feel like we've strayed too far from who we're supposed to be. But just like Samson, we can find redemption and purpose, even in our darkest hours, if we have the courage to reach out and embrace it.